The Pannonian Avars, Aevrs, also known as the Obrai, the Abaroian Varchanitai, and the Pseudo-Avars and Varchanites, were a group of Eurasian nomads of unknown origins. During the early Middle Ages, the name Pannonian Avars is used to distinguish them from the Avars of the Caucasus, who may have been an unrelated people. They established the Avar Khaganate, which spanned the Pannonian Basin and considerable areas of Central and Eastern Europe from the late 6th to the early 9th century. They were ruled by a Khagan, who was assisted by an entourage of professional warriors. Although the name Avar first appeared in the mid-5th century, the Pannonian Avars entered the historical scene in the mid-6th century, on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, as a band of warriors who wished to escape the rule of the Gokturks. The Avars language or languages are unknown. Historical sources suggest that ruling and subject clans spoke a variety of languages. Proposals by scholars include Caucasian, Iranian, Mongolic Tungusic, and Turkic. However, over time, Proto-Slavic became the lingua franca of the Avar Khaganate. Early literary sources. The earliest clear reference to the Avar ethnonym comes from Priscus the Rhetor. Priscus recounts that, 463, the Saragas, Onogars and Ogres were attacked by the Sabirs, who had been attacked by the Avars. In turn, the Avars had been driven off by people fleeing, man-eating griffins, coming from the ocean. Whilst Priscus's accounts provide some information about the ethno-political situation in the Don-Cuban Volga region after the demise of the Huns, no unequivocal conclusions can be reached. In fact, Denis Sinor has argued that whoever the Avars referred to by Priscus were, they differed from the Avars who appear a century later, during the time of Justinian, the next author of late antiquity to discuss the Avars, Menander Protector in the 6th century. Details Gokturk embassies in Constantinople in 565 and 568 AD. Each time, the Turks appear angered at the Byzantines for having made an alliance with the Avars, whom the Turks saw as their subjects and slaves. Terzanthos, a Turk prince, calls the Avars Varchanites and escaped slaves of the Turks, who numbered about 20,000. Many more, but somewhat confusing, details come from Theophylact Simacata, who wrote c. 629, but detailed the final 2 decades of the 6th century. In particular, he claims to quote a triumph letter from the Turk Lord Tamgan. For this very Chagan had in fact outfought the leader of the nation of the Abdali, conquered him, and assumed the rule of the nation. Then he enslaved the Avar nation. But let no one think that we are distorting the history of these times because he supposes that the Avars are those barbarians neighboring on Europe and Pannonia, and that their arrival was prior to the times of the Emperor Maurice. For it is by a misnomer that the barbarians on the Ister have assumed the appellation of Avars. The origin of their race will shortly be revealed. So, when the Avars had been defeated, some of them made their escape to those who inhabit Taugust. Taugust is a famous city, which is a total of 1,500 miles distant from those who are called Turks. Others of the Avars, who declined to humble a fortune because of their defeat, came to those who are called Mukrai. This nation is the closest neighbor to the men of Taugust. Then the Chagan embarked on yet another enterprise, and subdued all the Oga, which is one of the strongest tribes on account of its large population and its armed training for war. These make their habitations in the east, by the course of the river Til, which Turks are accustomed to call Melis. The earliest leaders of this nation were named Var and Chuni. From them some parts of those nations were also accorded their nomenclature, being called Var and Chuni. Then, while the Emperor Justinian was in possession of the royal power, a small section of these Var and Chuni fled from that ancestral tribe and settled in Europe. These named themselves Avars and glorified their leader with the appellation of Chagan. Let us declare, without departing in the least from the truth, how the means of changing their name came to them. When the Barcelt, Onagers, Sabir, and other Hun nations in addition to these, saw that a section of those who were still Var and Chani had fled to their regions, they plunged into extreme panic, since they suspected that the settlers were Avars. For this reason they honored the fugitives with splendid gifts and supposed that they received from them security in exchange. Then, after the Var and Chani saw the well-omened beginning to their flight, they appropriated the ambassador's error and named themselves Avars. For among the Scythian nations that of the Avars is said to be the most adept tribe. In point of fact, even up to our present times the pseudo-Avars are divided in their ancestry, some bearing the time-honored name of Var while others are called Chani. According to the interpretation of Dobrovets and Nekiva, the Turks insisted that the Avars were only pseudo-Avars, so as to boast that they were the only formidable power in the Eurasian steppe. The Gok Turks claimed that the real Avars remained loyal subjects of the Turks farther east. Furthermore, Dobrovets has questioned the authenticity of Theophylact's account. As such, they have argued that Theophylact borrowed information from Menander's accounts of Byzantine-Turk negotiations to meet political needs of his time, i.e., to castigate and deride the Avars during a time of strained political relations between the Byzantines and Avars. By calling the Avars Turkish slaves and pseudo-Avars, Theophylact undermined their political legitimacy. Postulated links with the Wan, Huthalites and other Inner Asian peoples. The French historian de Guines postulated a link between the Avars of European history with the Wan of Inner Asia based on a coincidence between Tardan Khan's letter to Constantinople and events recorded in Chinese sources, notably the Weishi and Peishi. The Chinese sources state that Tu-Men Khan, founder of Turkic dynasty and son of the legendary Ashina, defeated the Wan. Some of the Wan fled to the Chinese Western Way. Later, according to another Chinese source, Muhan Khan, Buman's successor, defeated the Itar, as well as the Tiela, who were also known as Ohus. Thus the events contained in the various Chinese sources, recording victories over the Tiela, Wan and Ita, seem to coincide with the narrative in the Turk envoy's letter, boasting of Tardan's victories over the Huthalites, Avars and Ogars. However, the two series of events are not synonymous. The events of the letter took place during Tardan's rule, 580 to 599, whilst Chinese sources referring to the Turk defeat of the Wan and other Inner Asian peoples occurred 50 years earlier, at the founding of the Turk Khanate by Buman. Thus Harmatta rejects the association of Avars with Wan. Further hypotheses linking them with the Huthalites are based on the Avars being called Varchanites by the Turks, i.e., being led by Var and Chani factions. 4. According to some Chinese transliterations, the term Var is rendered Wa, a term used by some Chinese sources when referring to the Huthalites. This appeared to be supported by the name of a Huthalite town, Varvalis. However, this has rather been interpreted to mean upper fortress in various Iranic languages. Steppe empire dynamics and ethnogenesis. Contemporary scholars are less inclined to view the tribal groupings mentioned in historical texts as monolithic and long-lived nations, but were rather volatile and fluid political formations whose dynamic depended on the sedentary civilizations they bordered as well as internal power struggles within the barbarian lands. In 2003, Walter Pohl summarized the formation of nomadic empires. The Avars were likely a losing faction previously subordinate to the Ashina clan in the western Turkic Khaganate. This fled west of the Dnieper. 2. These groups usually were of mixed origin, and each of its components was part of a previous group. 3. Crucial in the process was the elevation of a Khagan, which signified a claim to independent power and an expansionist strategy. This group also needed a new name that would give all of its initial followers a sense of identity. 4. The name for a new group of steppe riders was often taken from a repertoire of prestigious names which did not necessarily denote any direct affiliation to or descent from groups of the same name. In the early Middle Ages, Huns, Avars, Bulgars, and Ogres, or names connected with Gur, were most important. In the process of name-giving, both perceptions by outsiders and self-designation played a role. These names were also connected with prestigious traditions that directly expressed political pretensions and programs, and had to be endorsed by success. In the world of the steppe, where agglomerations of groups were rather fluid, it was vital to know how to deal with a newly emergent power. The symbolical hierarchy of prestige expressed through names provided some orientation for friend and foe alike. Such views are mirrored by Csanad. Barlant. The ethnogenesis of early medieval peoples of steppe origin cannot be conceived in a single linear fashion due to their great and constant mobility. With no ethnogenetic, theoretical, proto-people, or proto-language. Moreover, Avar identity was strongly linked to Avar political institutions. Groups who rebelled or fled from the Avar realm could never be called Avars, but were rather termed Bulgars. Similarly, with the final demise of Avar power in the early 9th century, Avar identity disappeared almost instantaneously. Anthropological evidence. Anthropological research has revealed few skeletons with Mongoloid-type features. Although there was continuing cultural influence from the Eurasian nomadic steppe, the late Avar period shows more hybridization, resulting in higher frequencies of Euro-Mongoloids. Mongoloid and Euro-Mongoloid types compose about one-third of the total population of the Avar graves of the 8th century. According to Pannonian, the early Avar anthropological material was almost exclusively Europoid in the 7th century, while grave goods indicated Middle and Central Asian parallels. On the other hand, cemeteries dated for the 8th century contained Mongoloid elements among others. He analyzed population of the Danube-Tisa Midland region in the Avar period and found that 80% of them showed Europoid characteristics. The Turanid was most common Europoid type among the Avars' graves. Paleolithic. The Turanid type is a Caucasoid type with significant Mongoloid admixture, arising from the mixture of the Andronovo type of Europoid features and the Oriental social and tribal structure. The Carpathian Basin was the center of the Avar power base. The Avars resettled captives from the peripheries of their empire to more central regions. Avar material culture is found south to Macedonia. However, to the east of the Carpathians, there are next to no Avar archaeological finds, suggesting that they lived mainly in the Western Balkans. Scholars propose that a highly structured and hierarchical Avar society existed, having complex interactions with other barbarian groups. The Khagan was the paramount figure, surrounded by a minority of nomadic aristocracy. A few exceptionally rich burials have been uncovered, confirming that power was limited to the Khagan and a close-knit class of elite warriors. In addition to hordes of gold coins that accompanied the burials, the men were often buried with symbols of rank, such as decorated belts, weapons, stirrups resembling those found in Central Asia, as well as their horse. The Avar army was composed from numerous other groups, Slavic, Gepidic and Bulgar military units. There also appeared to have existed semi-independent, client tribes which served strategic roles, such as engaging in diversionary attacks and guarding the Avars' western borders abutting the Frankish Empire. Yet other tribes were equals and allies of the Avars, such as Khanzabagans, Kuchagul Bulgars and Ardagasticislavs. which often conducted autonomous offensives into Byzantine land. Initially, the Avars and their subjects lived separately, except for Slavic and Germanic women who married Avar men. Eventually, the Germanic and Slavic peoples were included in the Avarish social order and culture, itself Persian-Byzantine in fashion. Scholars have identified a fused, Avar Slavic culture, characterized by ornaments such as half-moon-shaped earrings, Byzantine-styled buckles, beads, and bracelets with horn-shaped ends. Paul Foraker notes, here appears in the 7th century a mixed Slavic-Avar material culture, interpreted as peaceful and harmonious relationships between Avar warriors and Slavic peasants. It is thought possible that at least some of the leaders of the Slavic tribes could have become part of the Avar aristocracy. Apart from the assimilated Gepids, a few graves of West Germanic peoples have been found in the Avar lands. They perhaps served as mercenaries. Language. The ethno-linguistic affiliation of the Avars is uncertain. Although there is sparse knowledge about the Avar language, scholars have suggested that the Avars could have spoken Caucasian, Iranian Mongolic, Tungusic, and Turkic. Over time, Slavic became the lingua franca of the Avars.